I want to thank you all for coming tonight. On November 30th, 1967, Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota announced that he would challenge his party's incumbent president, Lyndon Johnson, for the Democratic nomination. This remains to me, after all these years, one of the most transcendent moments in American political life. It was an act of courage, but also one of great personal sacrifice. Some said self-immolation even. McCarthy surely knew that there would be a price to pay, that any future he might hope to have in his party would now be at an end. But McCarthy believed deeply that the war in Vietnam was a disaster for America and should come to an end. And he was also troubled by the expansive claims members of the Johnson administration were making before congressional committees, asserting that the president was free to pursue whatever course he saw fit in Vietnam, independent of any participation or approval by the congressional branch of government. Few thought McCarthy had any chance of taking his party's nomination away from a man widely acknowledged to be the period's most adept and powerful politician. But on March 13th, 1968, McCarthy came within 6 points of defeating Johnson in the New Hampshire primary. It was an unexpected and shocking near upset that caused Johnson to decide to drop out of the race later that month. Campaigning in front of a large and energized crowd in Wisconsin a few days later, McCarthy began his speech by reciting a poem. I hear America singing, the varied carols I hear. Those of mechanics, each one singing his as it should be, blithe and strong. The carpenter singing his as he measures his plank or beam. The mason singing his as he makes ready for work and leaves off work. The boatman singing what belongs to him in his boat. The deckhand singing on the steamboat deck. The shoemaker singing as he sits on his bench. The hatter singing as he stands. The woodcutter's song. The plowboy's on his way to the morning, or at noon, intermission, or at sundown. The delicious singing of the mother or the young wife at work, or of the girls sewing or washing, each singing what belongs to him or her and to none else. The day what belongs to the day. At night, the party of young fellows, robust, friendly, singing with open mouths their strong, melodious songs. Try for a moment to imagine anyone you know in American politics today doing something like this, getting up and reading a poem. But sadly, what is even more unimaginable is that anyone now would read this poem. Walt Whitman's America is not the America we live in today. That Eugene McCarthy could still believe that it might be in the midst of the national divisions in 1968 has something poignant about it. For Whitman's poem evoked a vision of America where each person had his own song to sing. It was an America where each person's trade and lot in life was worthy of respect, but, as in the sound and rhythm of his poem, those varied carols somehow joined together in one chorus that was America. We live today in a time of division and dissonance. In fact, it is hard to hear anyone singing at all. What makes a nation is, as the French historian Ernest Renan noted, the clearly expressed desire to continue a common life. A nation's existence is a daily plebiscite, he said. We may wonder if we have lost the desire to continue a common life together these days. But if we have not utterly given up that hope, then it is perhaps worth recalling that it is in the times of great division we are forced to consider again who we are as a nation, what we believe, and what things we hold dear, to decide together what we want to be the contours of our freedom and that common life we wish to share together. The ordeal has always made us better people, I think. Yes, we need to take pride in our diversity, in our individual and group identities. They are the means we use to negotiate a sense of respect among others, to argue for our place and value in our national community. But diversity is not of itself a national identity. Perhaps what the moment calls for is that we focus less for a while on asserting our various identities and think a little more about what things we share or want to share in common. and all of us need to be a part of that conversation. Our guest tonight is a prolific and celebrated author with a wide range of interest. He has written major biographies of Eric Clapton, Francis Ford Coppola, Allen Ginsberg, and Phil Oakes, who sang us into this evening's event. He's written on the cartoonist Will Eisner and Al Capp, as well as books on some of the famous shipping disasters on the Great Lakes, the Edmund Fitzgerald. He is here to talk to you tonight about his newest book, The Contest, the 1968 Election and the War for America's Soul. Publishers Weekly has said of The Contest, this durable history underlines all the nuance for readers who lived it and showcases the period's drama for readers new to one of the defining sagas of the 1960s. That would be most of you here tonight, I suppose. The historian Douglas Brinkley has said of The Contest, out of all of the books I've read on the 1968 election, this is the very best. And I concur in this. Wonderful book. Please join me in welcoming Michael Schumacher to the Burbank Public Library.
Oh, here it is. Got my notes. Lord have mercy.
It's been a rough, yeah.
I don't really have to talk tonight. I think he did it. You know, I'm impressed because I was born. I was 18 in 1968, which is to say, I knew everything there was to know. Or so I thought. Now, some of the things that very well-made points here that I think should be brought up is the division, the incredible division between parents and their children, the fights that we got into with our parents, literally in some cases physical. Sorry. Oh, okay. No, this is fine. Can you hear me all right? Yeah. I've got a loud mouth. But 68, people remember that year in strange ways. One of the things that's kind of funny, in fact, I'm gonna continue this too by reading a little something a little anecdote, because it does apply to what we're going to be talking about tonight in its own very strange way. One of the most common questions that I've been asked since this book came out is, well, how was this election like the one we just had 2 years ago? And it's a legitimate question. Because people today, so many of you weren't around in 68. You don't know. You drop names on people, names that were very, very, very famous back then. They've never heard of these people today. And that's to be understood. Because when I was 18, there were a lot of people in my parents' generation that I never heard of before, and some of whom I'm glad I hadn't. But what happened for me, this is kind of strange, because I was trying to think of an anecdote or something that would explain then and now. And I only had to go to my own high school reunion to get the answer to that. We just had, God help me for saying this out loud, my 50th high school class reunion. I am still alive. But it was, I've only been to a couple of my class reunions. I didn't go all the time. But I went to the 5th year reunion, which was the first one that we had after high school. And I went to the 50th, which was recently. And I'm just going to read this little anecdote that I wrote down, because I think this will launch us into what I'm going to be talking about tonight. Obviously, I don't have one millionth of the time probably necessary to give you everything you need to know about this, but we'll see what we can do. And this is what I have. In 1973, 5 years after my graduation from high school, my class held its first reunion at a restaurant owned by the father of one of my classmates. At one point, my head pounded from the din of the music and the conversation, and I stepped outside for a cigarette and some quiet. I was greeted by the sight of about 10 classmates standing close together in a small circle. The pungent smell of marijuana, probably ditchweed since no one had any money back then, filled the air. Somehow, life happened, and 45 years later, at our 50th reunion, my classmates assembled to survey the handiwork of time long past. This celebration was held at an exclusive country club, and as before, I stepped outside with a friend to avoid the talk and noise. And, as before, a small group assembled for communal sharing of what was probably much higher grade pot, smoked by folks with white hair and silver ponytails. Apparently, the old saw is true. The more things change, the more they stay the same. I was reminded of all this when I was promoting my book, The Contest, the 1968 election and the War for America's Soul. One of my most frequently asked questions at the bookstore appearances and readings focused on the similarities between the two elections. Some of the similarities, that's not that hard a word to pronounce, were obvious. Both elections came at a time when a country was deeply divided, and both were largely about change. Both were decided by a razor-edge thin margin. Both were won by Republicans, ending 8 years of Democrats in the Oval Office. Both were extremely contentious from primary season to election night. And it seems to me, and this is what I'm going to talk about a little bit tonight, that in 68 and in 2016, it was almost like the perfect storm of things coming together to make things the way they were. Now, in 68, now I've got my little thing here, okay. In 1968, I hope I do this right. No? There we go. There were two major issues in 68. Civil rights, which became law and order. That was a nice euphemism, because he didn't want to make it sound like we were not anything other than angelic toward the blacks. So he called it law and order. And then the other one was the Vietnam War. This photo here is an immensely important photo. It's a picture of Hubert Humphrey, who ran. He was the vice president at the time, and he ran for election after Johnson dropped out. He's giving a speech in 1948 in this picture. It was a speech calling for the Democrats. It was at their convention, calling on the Democrats to open up a debate on civil rights. They didn't want to do that. The South was largely Democratic. They didn't want to lose the South. Truman was in a lot of trouble. He was president at the time. He was in a lot of trouble. Looked like he might even lose the race. And this was a very brave thing. He was the mayor of Minneapolis at the time. He wasn't even a senator. And he gets up there and he gave this speech, which really, really began in its own informal way the civil rights movement. Because the South, the senators from the South, walked out in group. They walked out and they formed what became known as the Dixiecrats. So that happened, and all hell broke loose in the years that came. But this is very important because Humphrey was not only a candidate in 68, but he started something that this whole election was really largely about. This man is the man that we heard about. This is Eugene McCarthy. And as you can see, he looks kind of like a poet, which he was. He looks like a college teacher. Norman Mailer said he looks like the head of an English department. And to some extent that's true. He had that look about him, didn't he? But when he announced that he was going to run, that was really, really almost unheard of. And what it reminded me of, when we talk about then versus now, is when Bernie Sanders, right? Bernie Sanders says, oh, we're not doing this right. And so I'm going to do this. And Eugene McCarthy was a Democrat, and he was challenging, as was mentioned, one of the most powerful people in the history of the United States Senate. And he was a very powerful president who passed, I might add, the 1964 and the 1965 Civil Rights Acts, which were the most important acts since Lincoln in this country. So, there was all this sort of a disturbance in the air, if that makes sense. The one thing that wasn't mentioned was in between the New Hampshire primary and the rest of them, Bobby Kennedy entered the race. Kennedy wanted nothing to do with it. He did not want to run, but he got talked into it against his own better wishes. And one of the most eerie things that I can remember that I learned when I was researching this book was Kennedy was talking to a civil rights leader, and he said to him, he says, "I fear there are guns between me and the White House." There are guns. There certainly were. I was a Kennedy supporter. I should say that up front so that you understand how I feel about this man. Here's Nixon with John Kennedy in 1960. And Nixon became the next president. He was the winner of this election in 68. And here he is trying to glad hand John Kennedy, which wasn't working too well. Kennedy destroyed him in a series of debates. There's Bobby. And I might add, that's Bobby with about as short a hair as you ever saw him in those days. He must have been on his best behavior. Although I think this was like taken around 1964. But, and here's George Wallace. And he was a segregationist, a strict segregationist. He's from Alabama, former governor of Alabama. He had running with him a guy named Curtis LeMay as his running mate. And they called him Bombs Away Curtis LeMay because he believed in nuking, and he actually gave a talk where he talked about, we have a hang-up here about the use of nuclear weapons. He's talking this. I'm like, well, yes, could end civilization, could end the world as we know it. But he went on and on. He says, look, I've been to Bikini Atoll, and I've seen where they did the tests. And right now the bushes are all growing back, and the animals are looking okay. He says, now, the sand is still showing some signs of nuclear issues, and the crabs apparently picked that up in their claws, so I wouldn't eat the crabs. This is, so in those days, in 68, and now, you have people that say the most ridiculous stuff you've ever heard in your life, and they really try to pass it off as being knowledgeable. But this was George Wallace with his stars and bars, so to speak. And there's George Wallace again, standing off to the left, blocking the entry to the University of Alabama so 2 young black students could not attend. He's blocking it, and the guy on the right was the Assistant Attorney General at the time. But these are all, I mention all this because these are all really hot issues in 68. They were very, very hotly debated. And Wallace had a huge supporting. When the votes were counted at the end of the election in 68, he won more votes than any third-party candidate in history, more electoral college votes. That year, in 1968, and this is very important as far as Bobby Kennedy's entry into the race, there had been riots in the big cities in 67. And they, meaning Johnson and some of the others in power, had asked the governor of Illinois, Otto Kerner, to study this violence and to come up with a report on what is going on. Why are cities burning down? The Kerner report, which was released in March of 68, concluded that in this country there were two separate and very unequal races of people. And it was leading to much of the violence we're seeing in the urban areas in this country. And so Johnson didn't want to hear this. He had a fit. And when Kennedy heard about it, he wanted it to go a step further. And when Johnson refused, that was the thing that really kind of pushed him over the top into entering the election. He didn't want to. He was going to run in 72. He figured Johnson was going to win in 68, I'll run in 72, and everything will be good. But they pushed him further and further into this against his own will almost. And that was one of the big things. He asked Johnson what he was going to do, and Johnson just refused to have anything to do with this report. So Kennedy thought, okay, that's it. Because he was a big believer in, civil rights for one thing, but urban areas and the blight and the ghettoization, as they called it then, of America. Here you have President Johnson, big, long, tall Texan, and Hubert Humphrey in maybe the most embarrassing political photo that's ever been taken. Why Hubert agreed, he was the vice president at the time, but why he agreed to get on a horse in a suit and put on a ridiculous-looking hat and ride around with Johnson, boggles the imagination. But that's what that picture is. Now here he is signing the legislation I was talking about in 64 and 65. Those 2 years, incredibly important legislation was being passed, allowing all Americans, not just white Americans, all Americans, to have equal rights. And it was very, very contentious. No, I'm not going to talk. This, I just put this in a book because it cracked me up. It's people watching television. You remember television before all the internet, and that's one of the major issues. This is one of the reasons they're very, very different today, is we didn't have that back then. There was no Facebook, no social media. Now this is an incredible photo. Some of you may have heard of John Lewis, the great civil rights leader today. He's a congressman from Georgia. That's a very young John Lewis on the ground getting his skull split at the Selma March. He literally had a fractured skull from what they did to him while he marched in Selma. And you've heard of Selma, because they've made movies about it. They actually studied this in school, I am told. Well, this was one guy, and I was very blessed to have been able to speak to him for this book, that was trying just to, all they wanted was what every white guy in Alabama had, but it didn't go so well for him there. This is my favorite photo, bar none, from the book. There's Bobby Kennedy down in Mississippi. And so far, I'm just talking about civil rights because that's one of the big issues. But we're going to get to Vietnam here, too. Now, here we go. After these are all pictures having to do with Vietnam. That photo that I showed before, that's during the Tet Offensive, it was called. January of 1968, the North Vietnamese government staged, or their military staged, a raid into South Vietnam, where they attacked almost every major city in South Vietnam. It wasn't, the South Vietnamese / United States drove them off, ultimately. But what this proved was that these people had a lot more than we were being told, the truth wasn't being told in Vietnam. Walter Cronkite, how many people have heard of Walter Cronkite? Because he was probably the most respected journalist in America. There's a very funny story to me. Walter Cronkite going into work the first day of the Tet Offensive, all hell's breaking loose. And he walks in, he was at CBS, and he walks in, and he looks at the tape announcing that this has happened. And he looks up and he says, "What the hell is going on here? I thought we were winning this war." That's a direct quote. He demanded that they send him, CBS, to Vietnam, where he went, and he reported, there was a special report where he said, we can't win this war. And Johnson's reaction to that was, well, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost all of Middle America. And it was true. This was a very, very important turn of events. And so you're looking at just the trash in the city. And here is Johnson talking with, and Humphrey, talking with one of the generals, who's giving them just a load of BS, really. When you went into, one of the things that was fun about writing this book was I got to go into these files, these real old, files that were in the Johnson Library, that were in the Kennedy Library, in the Nixon Library, and so forth. And you're reading these people saying with a straight face, now this is what's happening, and it was a bald-faced lie. You at the time, that was different from today. Everybody expects the politicians are lying to them today. But back then, you didn't believe that. You believed that they were telling you the truth. And then after all of this in Vietnam, that changed. And you can see, look at John, he looks like an old man in that picture. He wasn't that old. Here he is announcing that he won't run again. He just won't. This was on television. And again, he looks like, what was Johnson when he died? I forget how old he was. He was in his very early 60s. He died of a heart attack. And one of the reasons he said he wasn't going to run, incidentally, was he didn't think he'd survive another term in office. His family all came from very, very short lives, the men. His father died, I think, when he was 50. But here he is just saying he's not going to run again, which set off. Now here's the Tet Offensive again. Photos, all the historical photos that you can find, because it was the bloodiest part of the whole Vietnamese campaign. And these are real, and this, to me, is one of the most moving photos in the book about Vietnam. This is LBJ Johnson, the president, on the phone. Look at the body language, look at what's happening here. You see the tape recorder. He's on the phone talking to his son-in-law. He had 2 daughters. Both of them were married to men that served in Vietnam. And here he is, he's talking to his son-in-law in Vietnam. And it's breaking him. He's a broken man. He didn't know what to do about Vietnam. So he, rather than change anything, he just let it go. That was the horrible part, was he just let it continue. There were people that were called the wise men. I talk about it in the book. All these very, very, they're aging, but by aging, I'm talking about maybe their 70s or something. They're not ancient. People that used to hold very, very powerful positions in this country. They all got together, and that's what their nickname was, the wise men, and advised Johnson. In November of '67, after there was a big rally in the Pentagon, and Johnson called him and said, "What should I do?" There's a big anti-war rally. I think I have a picture of it, in fact. And they said, "Stay the course. You're doing the right thing." In March of '68, after the Tet Offensive, after all the craziness in Vietnam, he called them back, and they said, "Get the hell out of there." That was their take. And he felt betrayed by them, but that's how he felt, that he should continue. He thought that if we left, South Vietnam would fall, all these people would be killed, et cetera, et cetera. What was going to happen anyway, as he found out. This talk, he's wearing his brother Jack's raincoat in his speech. It was kind of eerie. This was taken on April 4th, 1968. Bobby was in Indiana campaigning when he got word that Martin Luther King had been assassinated, or had been shot. He wasn't dead yet. He got on a plane in Muncie, Indiana. He'd given a speech at Ball State and was going to Indianapolis, where he was going to give a talk on the back of a flatbed truck, which he's doing here. He was supposed to give a talk in one of the most impoverished areas in Indianapolis. When he showed up, literally, he was plane lit down. He was being driven over to give this speech. He was told that Martin Luther King had died, and that the people he would be addressing did not know this. They had no idea. And the police chief told him, don't do it. Do not do it. I can't guarantee your safety. His wife begged him, just come back to the hotel. You're in a lot of trouble if you go there. And Kennedy said, nope. And he went. And if you look that up on YouTube, you get to see that speech. And it's one of the most powerful speeches ever delivered in the history of this country. He had no notes. He got up in front of them, and they were having, the band is playing, everybody's happy. They think he's going to give a big election speech. And he stopped them, and he said, I'm only going to talk for a few minutes. He said, and I wish I could quote him directly. I mean, I can if I look in the book, but I'm too lazy. He said something along the line that I have some very, very sad news for all of us who believe in freedom. Martin Luther King has been murdered. And the whole place, all those people, look at all those people, as far as you could see, the shock that you hear that goes through it. And what made this thing work was Kennedy took it right on, straightforward. And he said that the only time his brother died, since his brother died in 1963, and this was in 68, in that 5-year period, that he ever publicly mentioned his brother's assassination. He says, and what was brought up earlier tonight in that introduction. We have to figure out who we are as Americans. Who are we? That's a question we might want to ask today, shouldn't we? Who are we? And he said, I know how you feel. He said, I too lost someone I loved to an assassin's bullet. And it was the most moving thing. I remember John Lewis was there for that speech, and he said people were crying. He said they could not believe. It's only like 7 minutes. It doesn't take long. But you might want to look this up, because it is really a totally amazing speech that he gave in the wake, without notes. He tried to write a few things down on a piece of paper. He never consulted them. He just got up there and he gave this speech. And it's an amazing, amazing turn of events. This is the student takeover. I won't even, just to give you an idea of how crazy that year was, college students took over Columbia University, Ivy League school in New York. These are photos from it. This is the rioting after Martin Luther King's assassination. They burned down, they literally had machine gun turrets on the steps of the nation's capital. It was bad. These are much better times. Here, this is Bobby Kennedy on the road. And I think it was in California. And here he is debating Eugene McCarthy. The two of them ended up, they started out as friends, and they weren't so friendly by the end of this campaign. But when Bobby was assassinated on June 4th, he was shot. 2 months to the day after Martin Luther King. When he was shot, McCarthy just fell apart. Even though they were almost enemies when it happened, it affected him so deeply that he just gave up on the race, essentially. He stayed around for the convention and so forth, but he didn't campaign. He just said, I'm going part-time from this point on. He just gave up. But this is how crazy that year was. We were talking earlier tonight, this young guy and me, about the 60s. Everybody remembers what they want to remember about the 60s and how great they were. I'm here to tell you I lived through this year, and I don't remember a lot of it very fondly. There was an awful lot that was going on, and it was happening so fast, it was coming at you, and at you, and at you. You just recover from one, and you get hit with another. And, you know, you started to believe, when I was watching on television, the California primary had ended, and Robert Kennedy gave his acceptance speech, and it was very powerful. The place was packed with people, the Ambassador Hotel, and he gave a very powerful speech. And at the end, he just says, "Okay, let's move on. Let's go to Chicago and win there." And when he did that, he flashed a peace sign, and he turned to go how he normally goes, which was he always walked through the crowd when he left the building. He was running behind in the schedule, and so he was led away through a kitchen, pantry area. His bodyguards were helping his wife, who was just announced pregnancy with her 11th child, and they were helping her off the stage. And there was all this, all the people, you know, the reporters and so forth, were reporting what was going on, and I was watching this. And all of a sudden, all hell is breaking loose. Well, Bobby had been shot in the head at point blank range, and he didn't die that night. He was strong, but he died the next night, overnight. I love this picture. McCarthy's kids. They were, all the young people loved McCarthy. And, you know, I was one of the rare exceptions in my group. I liked McCarthy plenty, but I was a Kennedy guy. My friends all worked for McCarthy. He had the clean for Gene, they called it. All these hippies, like this guy on the left, they shaved their beards, they cut their hair, and they went from place to place. Clean for Gene. And it made a tremendous impact on people, certainly at the beginning of the race. Once Kennedy entered the race and Humphrey entered the race, there were all these people running, so it was hard to get, you know, much of a foothold on anything. It was very, very tight. And here's McCarthy campaigning. Gene's got guts. You know, those were exciting times as well as really, really like tragic ones or difficult ones. I remember watching, I was watching at a hall in my hometown in Wisconsin when Barack Obama won the first time. People were crying. There was more excitement, and I don't think it had anything much more to do with anything other than here is a possible personification of hope. And with this race, what was hard about this race was this was the end of hope in its own way. When Nixon won, that was the end of all these years of Democratic dominance. And this goes back to Roosevelt, you know, in the late 30s and 40s, where all of a sudden, all of this was changing. It moved toward this conservative movement that followed. Because after Nixon, there was Ford, of course, who finished. But the big one, and he ran just on a limited basis in '68, was Ronald Reagan. And he was about as conservative as they made him. And he didn't get, he'd just been elected governor of California like 2 years earlier, like in '66. So he wasn't quite ready yet. And frankly, I remember times when Ronald Reagan, the name Ronald Reagan was a punchline. You know, he wasn't taken all that seriously. Well, he should have been. But what you're seeing here is a changing of the guard. Gene McCarthy really, really believed that we could end that war in Vietnam. He did. He thought that what you had to do was just quit listening to the generals and start paying attention to what's going on, what's really going on. And so, see him in this environment is something. Look at the people around him, the expressions on their faces and so forth. They really believed it. Well, here's Hubert Humphrey standing in front of the masses. Same deal. He's up there campaigning. It's hard. It's hard for me somehow to even remember. Some of these people were walking amongst us because Humphrey was a good man. He was a lot of things, but at the core, he was a good man. I didn't agree with him at all on Vietnam. I wonder about that today, incidentally. Afghanistan has gone on longer than Vietnam. Now, why isn't all hell breaking loose? There's no draft. Nobody feels the urge. The whole take is if you want to go over there and fight, that's your business. Back then, you didn't have any choice. You went. I lost 2 good friends in Vietnam. Now here is Hubert Humphrey, and maybe one of the best politicians to ever run. Edmund Muskie was his vice presidential candidate, and he was probably a better presidential candidate than Humphrey was. But it's a nice, it was a good choice on his part. And Muskie might have been the only sane guy in some respects that was running late in the game. Nobody seems to respect any politicians anymore. They expect they're going to be lied to. They expect the worst. That's sort of like the way I travel, incidentally. When I'm going on the plane, I figure I'd make a list of all the things that can go bad, and then if it doesn't go bad, I feel kind of good about the whole thing. But that's how Muskie was. Here's Wallace. Now, there you go. There's bombs away, Curtis LeMay. There he is. Now, the thing is about LeMay was he was one tremendous warrior. He really was. And here's Nixon. But look at the nowadays you wouldn't even have that. It just doesn't happen. They campaign differently, but they still. This is the object then and now. I love this picture. Now I could do a whole lecture about this whole thing here. Nixon. I'm going to give it to you the real short end of it because I'm going to get kicked out of here pretty quick. Nixon cut a deal with the South Vietnamese government, and it was the deal was brokered through a woman who was highly connected in South Vietnam, Anna Chennault. Her husband was the head of the Flying Tigers. He's a war hero during World War II. She was originally Asian. Moved to this country, became very, very big with the Republican Party. So she brokered the deal. Nixon said, at the time, they were trying to get peace talks going in Paris. And Nixon told them, you keep South Vietnam away from those peace talks, I'll cut you a better deal. And that's exactly, they stayed away. Nixon was elected. No deal was cut. But a lesson was learned. And there's Reagan on the far right. And Romney and Rockefeller, these were the 3 leading losers. Well, they were. They all ran and they all got knocked out in the primaries. Here's Spiro Agnew. I could do about 2 hours on him. Because Spiro was nuts. And here are the Democratic National Convention. They're gathering the candidates. They're really this, and again, I'm just going to pass over this. This is Chicago, '68, the convention. Look at that. This is Chicago, 1968. The police beating the protesters. This is Daley. And I can't even repeat out loud what it is he shouted. But this was the mayor of Chicago shouting this. Because he was mad because Abe Ribicoff, senator, Connecticut, I believe, got up in front of the masses at that convention and said, if George McGovern were elected president, we wouldn't be bothered by the kind of Gestapo tactics we're seeing here in Chicago. And that didn't go over well, to say the least. But you can look at, there's, that's Derry Rubin on the left, David Dillinger in the middle, and Abbie Hoffman on the right. I don't know, how many people have ever heard of any of those people? Except the older ones in the crowd, yeah. Most people really haven't, you know. But on my Facebook page, it's me and Dave Dillinger in the middle talking. I was so proud of that chance to meet him and spend some time with him. It was a beautiful, he was a conscientious objector. During World War II, he did 2 prison terms for refusing to register, even though he didn't have to. He was in divinity school. He got a pass. He wasn't going to get drafted, but he was against that war on general principles. But Dave Dillinger was one of my heroes. And let me just say this about that. Richard Nixon, and that's, you know, I'm just going to, you know, you people have to have questions. And I'd be happy to answer any of them. Well, for one thing, when they had the riots in Chicago in the spring of '68, he issued an order to shoot to wound looters and shoot to kill arsonists. That was really an amazing thing for anybody to say, you know, shoot to kill. Now, that was repeated in Chicago. He had the National Guard there. Chicago is real interesting because one of the things I did when I worked on the book was I got the FBI reports. And the estimations are between 1 in 5 and 1 in 6 of the people out on the streets, the so-called hippie, disruptive, demonstrator, were FBI plants. They were throwing bricks. Yeah. And when you see this in black and white, it's pretty amazing. And what Daley did was he just set up an armed camp there where the convention was being, you were being funneled into this very thin, you almost couldn't get into the hall. It was so crazy. And it was an entire working of razor wire you had to see to believe. It was really, really, he was going to control this or die trying. One of my proud moments with this book, I'm going to say this, I'm very happy. I was the first one that I know of to spend any time writing about the dissidents. You know, and that included what happened in Chicago. But Abbie Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, I never met Abbie Hoffman, but Jerry Rubin I met and talked to, and Tom Hayden, who a lot of people in California should know about, and Bobby Seale. All these people I got to meet and got to interview. The thing was, the dissidents got a lot of room in this book. And I showed you how people thought of Abbie Hoffman as this sort of silly, you know, foolish. Well, Abbie Hoffman got his skull cracked as a freedom rider. These people, when Abbie Hoffman was on the lam toward the end of his life from the government, he was hiding out in plain sight. He was working as an activist for an environmentalist group. These people weren't what they were presented to be. Abbie Hoffman was also a real crazy trickster, but I love that about him too. You know, me and my father, we were Archie and a meathead. I'm not kidding you. We fought like there was no tomorrow. Almost got physical a couple times. And then all these years later, I found my son is seen walking out of the recruitment office in my hometown by my sister-in-law. And she goes, Adam, what are you doing? And he goes, well, I don't know. I really can't. I don't have any sense of direction in my life. Maybe I'll join the Army. And she goes, oh, my God, did your father know about this? He goes, no. And so he goes home. He talks to his mother. He goes, I just was over there at the Army Recruitment Center. She said, you didn't. He says, no, I did not yet. My take on it was, because he comes wandering in with his mother, very, very chaste, so to speak. And they said, we got something we got to talk to you about. And I said, okay. We sat down, and he told me that he'd gone into the recruitment, he was thinking of joining, and so forth. And I said, listen, buddy, you don't need my permission. You're old enough, you're a man. But I want you to know that this is what is going to happen if you join. And I didn't talk about blood. We weren't at war at the time. I didn't talk about anything other than what happens when you went to basic training and what happens. What kind of person are you when you come out? Young people are being sent to slaughter. Now, do you think you can do that? If you think you can, then go. I will support you in every respect. That's what I told them. But, these were times when, I wish my father had that conversation with me. Not that I would have gone, but I wish we'd had that understanding. That, this whole generational thing was tough. It was very tough. And I fear we may be heading back into that a little bit more than before, because I like to believe that young people today are a lot smarter than we are.
I really appreciate you all coming. Thank you very much. I want to thank